Good afternoon and welcome to today's Wilberforce lecture. My name is David Richardson. I'm a former director of the Institute, and it's my great pleasure and indeed privilege to introduce today's speaker, who's Filipa Ribeiro de Silva. I've had the good fortune to work with Filipa for a number of years, particularly on work on the South Atlantic in the era of the slave trade. And I'm delighted that she's had an opportunity to return to the Wilberforce Institute today to talk about a project on which she's currently engaged, and which I think we had a preview of, in a way, in an article that she's published recently in Slavery and Abolition. Just to say a few things about Filipa's work. She's graduate of the University of Lisbon and completed a PhD at Leiden in 2009. The fact that she came out of Lisbon and worked in Leiden should tell you a lot. She's interested in the Portuguese and the Dutch Atlantic worlds. And that in itself is a real mark of her difference from other scholars, many of whom work on a single national interest in terms of the Atlantic world. She came to the Wilberforce Institute in 2009, and I had the pleasure of working with her. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute, based upon some European funding that we were able to raise in collaboration with some scholars, particularly in France. Following a time at the Institute, she went on to Macau and worked there for a couple of years. And then in 2015, returned to Amsterdam, where she became a senior researcher at the International Institute for Social History there. Her work has tended to focus on issues of population, labour, migration and trade in sub-Saharan Africa in both the pre-colonial and the post-colonial, or in the colonial period, and possibly even the post-colonial period as well. So she has a very wide spectrum of interest covering a long period of time. She's the author of a book on the Dutch and Portuguese in Western Africa, and that was published with Brill in 2011. And the work that we did together, amongst other things, resulted in a book on networks and a transcultural exchange in the South Atlantic between 1590 and 1867. That also was published by Brill. Today's talk, I suspect, although I've not talked with Filipa particularly about this, but today's talk is on what I see as a relatively new project. She'll correct me if I'm wrong, and I often am, on gains and gainers in transatlantic slave trade and slave-based production towards a transnational approach. It's of particular interest to me, and I think it should be of great interest to a number of scholars, not only in this country, but in Europe. At the moment, I personally am involved with a number of what I might call younger generation scholars in Europe, looking at some issues of profitability in slavery on a transnational perspective. And so whatever Filipa has to say today is going to be of particular interest to me, but I suspect it's going to be of wider interest. The issue of the relationship between slavery and capitalist development in Europe has, of course, a long history. And whether she comes at it from that perspective or not, I'm not sure, but however she comes at it, it will be of considerable interest, I think, to a lot of people because of that traditional approach to the study of slavery and European development. So it's a great pleasure to me to introduce Filipa. I'm delighted you're back. You left us in 2013. I don't think you've been back since. So don't leave it another 9 years before you come back, please. Okay? We look forward to hearing what you've got to say, Filipa. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, David, for this very kind introduction. I guess I need to press like this. Okay, that works. I have to say that it's a great joy for me to be back. And it's a bit emotional as well, I have to say, because I think it has been more than 10 years that I was at the Wilberforce Institute. And some of you I haven't seen in 10 years, others I have seen in other locations. So it is indeed, I think I cannot express with words the joy I feel of being here. Having said that, what I want to talk about today in this paper that is entitled Rethinking the Numbers Game and the Debate on the Profits from Trading Enslaved Africans and Slave-Produced Commodities, Some Preliminary Steps Towards a Global Approach. Maybe I should start by giving you a little bit of background of how I started to think about this problem. As David just mentioned, I did publish an article on slavery and abolition at the beginning of next year, where I try to present a calculation of the gross profits of the Portuguese-Brazilian slave trade. But where I also did two other things. One of them was to discuss the problems associated with trying to calculate net profits for the Portuguese-Brazilian slave trade, given the complexity of the trade and the differences with the differences with the British or with Dutch. But what I also did is I did some exploration on what happened to the output of slave labor in Brazil, so in terms of what is produced by enslaved Africans, and where did those the commodities that were produced by enslaved Africans, where they end up. And one of the things that I have found out during that preliminary exploration was that there was a lot of gold, for example, ended up in West Africa that would have to the Netherlands or to Britain. There was also gold coming straight to Britain or coming to Britain via Portugal. So having figured out these through the literature, and the same could be said about also cotton, for example, that was produced in Brazil by enslaved workers, but ended up not in Portugal necessarily, but in multiple locations across Europe. I started to, become uncomfortable with this very national and imperial oriented approach to the study of the profits of the slave trade and the slave trade itself, as well as commerce on slave produced commodities. And this is where I started to think about this problem. It was during the writing of that paper. So that now you have a bit of background. So what I would like to do today basically is the following. I will very briefly talk about the gains and gainers debate, which is known to all of us here and those that are, I think, also online with us. And I will discuss a little bit of those, the shortcomings I see in this debate, especially in light of other literature that is not related with the discussion of the profits and the profitability of the slave trade, but that can inform this literature in a way. And then I will move on with exploring two examples to illustrate the complexity of assessing gains and gainers from slave trade and commerce in slave-produced goods, and how the national and imperial approach is problematic for that purpose. And then on the final part of the presentation, I would just like to discuss a couple of well, share with you some thoughts on how I think we could move the approach of the topic forward, and with what kind of methodologies and what kind of sources. So that's basically what I would like to do. So as well, we all know the discussion on the profits and of the profitability of the slave trade is a discussion that derives from the debate that was generated or started by the thesis by Eric Williams in the 1940s. And basically, and in a very short format, we could say that the Eric Williams thesis could be boiled down to two main questions. One of them was, were the profits of the slave trading crucial for the industrialization of Britain, and more broadly, how did slavery contribute to the development of capitalism? I mean, some of these of Eric Williams' propositions have been, questioned and demonstrated through research that they had no grounds, but the broader question of how did slavery contribute to the development of capitalism remains a crucial question. So the way I see this debate is, if I think of key moments, I have identified, I think, 5 key moments in the development of the debate around the thesis of Eric Williams and in what is related to the profitability and the profits of the slave trade. A first moment would be the genesis, not only with the work of Eric Williams, but also the works of Walter Rodney and other scholars that do not necessarily deal with the slave trade per se and the profitability of the slave trade, but that clearly demonstrate the negative effects that slave trade and slavery had for various regions of the world. Then there's a second moment that I think for which Dubois and Barbara Solow have contributed with the gathering of evidence and the development of new methodologies that allow for the expansion of the debate, especially the expansion of the debate to North America or the North American territories, if you want. But at the same time, and more or less during the same period, what we are going to see is also the development of a counter-narrative that questioned the Williams thesis and that put the Williams thesis into check. And while among several other scholars, I've named here only 3 names: Stan Engerman and Pete Emmer, who was in fact my former supervisor, and Patrick O'Brien, that clearly put forward an argument that, the profits of the slave trade were not significant enough to be considered as potentially responsible for financing the industrialization of Britain, but also the development of capitalism in other parts of the Western world. In any case, the discussion that these works, both against and in favor of Eric Williams, have stimulated, they have led a lot of scholars, in fact, to invest on research in the slave, in figuring out more about the slave trade itself, but also about slavery. I mean, we have David here in the room, who is one of the major contributors to the advancement of our knowledge in general about the transatlantic slave trade, together with also David Eltis and a very large team of people that have worked first on the CD-ROM with the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, and then later led to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Initiative that is, well, since 2000, the 2000s available online. all these data have allowed to develop further the debate, not only on the profits and the profitability of the slave trade, but the debate more generally on various topics related to the slave trade. In the last 10 years, we have seen a kind of a revival on the Eric Williams thesis discussion. And to a certain extent, this revival has been, in my understanding, triggered by, on one hand, the crisis of capitalism in roughly 10 years ago. On the other hand, also by an increasing pressure, and rightfully so, from Afro-descendant communities and descendants of enslaved Africans that do want to have their experience represented and heard and included in the national narratives of the countries where they are based. And this, so I'm thinking basically here of the works, for example, of Klaus Rombach, but also the works by Fata Black and Van Rossum, or more recently the works by Pepijn Brandon and Elba Bosma, who are in fact my colleagues at the International Institute. They have, started to, they brought up again the discussion of the Eric Williams thesis, but they also brought up a whole new series of methodologies to look at, the profitability of the slave trade and the profits of the slave trade, including, for example, using calculating gross profits and then try to weigh the value of those weight profits within national economies. And they also try to use value chain analysis as a way to measure the impact of slave produced on national economies. And Pepijn Brandon and Elba Bosma did the same, but instead of national economies, they used national GDP. Having said that, I myself have, as I said, contributed to this revival by trying to calculate the gross profits for the Portuguese Brazilian slave trade, as I said before, using, in fact, the gross profit approach that I just mentioned. At the same time, and completely, well, and not related to the debate on the transatlantic, on the profits of the transatlantic slave trade and slave-based production, there has been in the last 15 years a wide production of scholarship that deals with other topics, that deals with, reconstruction of merchant networks on one hand, that uses commodity chain analysis to track production of items that were essential as trade commodities for the slave trade, including, for example, linen, but also iron, for example. And I'm here thinking of the work of Klaas Weber, for example, or Chris Evans and Goran Ryder, or, for example, more recently, the work by Anka Stefan, among others, or Garcia Mouton, for example. And what these works show, their concern is not the profits of the slave trade or of slave-produced commodities, but what they show is that there's a lot of individuals and firms that, even though they are not directly involved in the slave trade or in commerce in slave-produced goods, they are gaining from these activities indirectly. There are regions that we wouldn't think that they were connected with the transatlantic slave trade or with commerce in slave-produced goods that are benefiting or not, but they are connected indirectly also to the slave trade. I mean, for example, Central Europe, where you have production of linen that is used in the slave trade, is a good example. So being, confronted with these two lines of scholarship, it becomes, it's this scholarship, in my understanding, it's starting to show clearly that, you know, maybe the national approach we have to the study of the slave trade and the study of commerce in slave produced goods, maybe that's not the best avenue to conduct research. Maybe we should try to look for a new way to look at profits and within these two economic activities, because there's a whole array of regions in Europe and as well as actors in Europe that will be profiting from slave trade and from commerce in slave produced goods directly and especially indirectly, that if we focus only on the national approach or on the imperial approach, they would not be taken, they will not be taken in. So I have forgotten to move forward the PowerPoint. I apologize for that. So, but these are the works that I was referring to. So I think having considered this literature and then putting it next to the literature on the profits and the profitability of the slave trade, I think there's a couple of critiques that could be made to the debate that has follow-up from the Eric Williams thesis on profits and profitability of slave trade and commerce in slave-produced goods. On one hand, most of this literature is very national-oriented, so it's about the British slave trade, the Dutch slave trade, the Portuguese-Brazilian slave trade. And it's very imperial oriented as well. And of course, I mean, I don't mean to take merit from the work that has been done. I've myself have contributed for this, but I think this is to a great extent the result of the way we are trained of thinking within the frame of the nation state and the frame of the empire. But maybe we need to move a bit beyond that, because by focusing within the nation state or the frame of the nation state and the frame of the imperial borders, we are unable to assess the spillover effects of the slave trade in terms of profits beyond national and imperial borders within Europe, for example, but also we are unable to look to the spillover effects beyond Europe. So because there were also gains to be had in Asia related to the slave trade, because a lot of the trade commodities that go into the supply in the provisioning of the slave trade, for example, come from Asia. I would argue there's also gains to be had in the Americas as well, and these have been not brought into the equation so far, with the exception of, for example, the gains that are made by planters in the Americas. So these are, in my view, maybe what we need to maybe decenter a bit on one hand from the Atlantic and start to look a bit beyond Europe, a little bit beyond the Atlantic, and eventually also look in what is going on in the Indian Ocean, because there's a lot of goods that are coming from the Indian Ocean that feed into the transatlantic slave trade, and the other way around. There's output of slave labor that does not stay within the Atlantic, but will also end up going to Asia as well. To discuss, to illustrate, in fact, some of these complexities, I would like to use one example. So what I did is I reconstructed a business network of a businessman from a Florentine origin that was based in Amsterdam, and while I can reconstruct his business activities for roughly 2 decades. And what we see when we reconstruct the business network of this man, Francisco Ferroni, we can have a glimpse of the complexity of the operations, in this case, of the slave trade. And I will read a little bit, if you will forgive me, because it will give you a bit of detail of what he was doing. In 1664, Francisco Ferroni, a Florentine merchant, ship owner and art dealer based in the city of Amsterdam in the Dutch Republic, acted as a representative of the leaseholders of the Spanish crown's Asiento for the supply of enslaved Africans to its territories in the Americas. These men, who were usually named Asentistas, were in fact not Spanish, but the Genovese merchants Grillo and Lomellini. In this capacity, so as their representative, Ferroni gave power of attorney to Martin Noel, a merchant of London and an investor in the Company of the Royal Adventures of England trading with Africa, to sign a contract with the agents of the Asentistas in Barbados for the supply of 600 to 1,000 Black Indians and Moors to the Spanish Americas. Given the liaisons between Noel and the Company of Royal Adventures of England, and the involvement of the agents of Grillo and Lomellini in the island, it is most likely that the enslaved people mentioned were to be transported by English ships from the ports in West Africa to Barbados and then re-exported to the Spanish Antilles. 5 years later, the same Ferroni signed a contract, an agreement with the Asentistas for the supply of enslaved Africans to Cartagena. But this time, he will be directly involved in the slave trade, because he will outfit a ship in Amsterdam, so in the Dutch Republic. And from there, the ship is supposed to go to Arde, which is nowadays Lade, controlled by the Dutch West India Company, and from there to Curaçao. And once in Curaçao, the enslaved Africans would be then sold to the representative of the Asentistas that were in Cartagena. So if we look at this example, and I could continue with a couple of more examples from this man, a couple of more contracts, but what I would like to highlight here is the following. So who benefits from the business network of this Francisco Ferroni and their linkage and his link with the Asiento? Multiple individuals. On one hand, the Spanish crown is benefiting by leasing the Asiento to a third party, in this case, Genovese merchants, Grillo and Lomellini. So we have the Spanish crown, we have, on the other hand, Genovese merchants, but we also have the Dutch WIC benefiting from this, because the operations of the WIC to operate within the jurisdiction of the WIC, Ferroni would have to pay what is known in the Dutch sources as the recognitie. So it's basically a fee of 2.5% to be authorized to trade. But we also have the Royal Company of the Adventures of England benefiting from the activities of these men within the framework of the Spanish Asiento. We have merchants in England like Martin Noel benefiting from these, but also merchants in Amsterdam like the Koyman brothers that will also be associated with Ferroni. We have capital coming from Italian cities, and we have a whole array of agents overseas in Cartagena, in Barbados, in Curaçao, in Madrid, that represent these merchants, and all of them are profiting from these specific activities. And if we look at this, I mean, we have people now here from different countries, from different empires, and profiting from the business in different capacities and in different ways. So having been confronted with several examples like this is one example, but there are others, I have started to think of how could we tackle this problem of having, so many actors involved that gain from the business and gain from the business in multiple capacities at the same time and in multiple regions. And one of the questions that I have really struggled with throughout this process is, when I look at examples like these, my first question is, under what national flag am I going to ascribe the profits? Are these profits for the Dutch? Are these profits for the Spanish? Are these profits for the English? I would say they are all profiting in this case. So, you know, maybe we need to, and this is one of the reasons I think we maybe need to abandon this national approach and start to, instead of approaching this problem from an angle of a nation, of an empire, rather than look instead at institutions and economic groups and social groups that are gaining from engaging in slave trading and also in commerce in slave-produced commodities. And then we can, once we do that, we can start thinking who engages directly with this, who engages indirectly, and where they do so, and why they do so, and how much they profit from this. And eventually from there will also come other questions which are more complex than what are the consequences, both positive and negative, from their involvement in these operations. But that's a far broader question for here. That's not what I intend to do. So what I have been, based on these core of questions, I have been trying to think of a way to be able to do this, to think beyond the national and the imperial level. And I thought of that maybe a possible solution would be to think of profits from slave trade and from slave-based production if we create clusters of profits. And see how who is gaining from the different clusters. So in my view, I think there are 5 core clusters of gains. There's gains from financial services, so individuals that provide insurance, credit, mortgages, both for the slave trade as well as for slave production. On the other hand, we have gains from logistics, being provisioning of ships, outfitting, freightage of ships, but also shipping. There's gains from administration and taxation of the trade, as of the trade in enslaved Africans, as well as on slave-produced commodities, and gains from trade itself. And this is probably what we know most about. That's why I put it in orange color. This is what most of the literature is devoted to. And then we have also gains that are derived from the output of slave labor. And this includes not only the wholesale of the raw materials, which is in fact what we know most about in this case, but also the processing of raw materials. So there's a whole of industries that are benefiting from processing raw materials that are produced by enslaved Africans, that we know very little about. What do these people gain from, you know, their involvement, even if indirect, in slave produced commodities. Then we have the wholesale of processed commodities as well as the retailing. And this is something that so far has not been taken into account when we think of profits of slave trading and profits of commerce from slave produced goods. And I think if we would try to look at it from using these clusters, not only we will be able to see that there are far more people profiting from these 2 activities, but what we will also see is that this doesn't take place only in Europe. This takes place in multiple regions at the same time. So I try to do the same think of these also in a geographical way. So if we think, for example, of the financial services, well, the financial services, indeed, most of them take place in Europe up to a certain period in time, because then we will start to have insurances also, especially in the Americas. But if we think of the gains from logistics, the logistics of the trade are not done only in Europe. Initially, they are done in Europe because the ships are outfitted in Europe initially and they are provisioned and so on. But These ships also stopped in Africa, and it is known that in the case of the Dutch and in the case of the British, there's no evidence of outfitting in Africa, but in the case of the Portuguese, there is evidence that they outfitted also in Africa, because they stayed too many weeks in Luanda, for example, and it was impossible to carry enough provisions for their voyage, plus the stay in Luanda, plus the Middle Passage. So there is evidence that suggests that there were individuals in Angola producing to provide foodstuff, on one hand, for example, for the slaves that await embarkation on the port, but they also provided for the Middle Passage as well, both for the enslaved and for the crews. Once the ships arrive in the Americas, again, the ships don't carry provisions from Europe enough to do the whole voyage. They have to be outfitted again in the Americas, which means that there are individuals in the Americas that are benefiting and gaining from provisioning for these ships to return back to Europe. So if we, and the same, what I just said very briefly, for the gains from provisioning can be also said about other types of activities. Commerce does not involve necessarily only, Europe. The commerce also involves, individuals in Africa itself. And we know very little of what did African merchants gain and African political elites gain from getting involved in these activities, especially in the slave trade, but also, for example, in certain territories, there's also production of goods, for example, African hides that are in many cases produced by enslaved Africans in Africa itself that will end up in the market. So, and we know very little about this. Who is profiting from this? How? And why? The same could be said for Asia. There's a lot of trading commodities that are used in the transatlantic slave trade that come from Asia. What did Asian merchants gain, or the European East India companies gain also from this? Because in fact they are the ones that very often bring the textiles, for example, to Europe from Asia that will end up in the streams of the slave trade. That we also know very little about. I don't know how I am for time, so I don't want to detain too long here.
I'm fine.
Yeah, I'm fine. Okay. But this is just to give an example. The same could be said also for the gains of the output of slave labor. We usually think of the output of slave labor coming back to the home country of one empire. But as we have seen from examples of the literature I quoted earlier, a lot of, for example, the cotton doesn't end up necessarily that is produced in Brazil, does not necessarily end up in Portugal, but is distributed to multiple countries throughout Europe. The same could be said for the tobacco that comes from either the French colonies, but also the North American colonies, or from Brazil. That tobacco ends up in Germany, ends up in Portugal, ends up in England, and so forth. And the same could be said about the Americas, because we forget very often there's internal consumption there. And we don't really know very much about the internal consumption there, and who is benefiting from, the consumption of these goods that are produced with slave labor. This is just a more detailed a diagram where I have plotted in the diagram the multiple actors that would be involved in these different clusters of gains from slave trading and from slave produced commodities. And I don't think there's a point in going through this diagram in detail, because a lot of these examples I've already mentioned of the different individuals that would be involved in it. So what I tried to do, it was again do a micro study and try to plot it into the diagram to see what would happen. So one of the throughout my work, I have reconstructed the business network and also the business portfolio of the Belmonte family. That was a Jewish family that is of Sephardic origin, that is based in the Dutch Republic. And I was able to reconstruct their business network and business profile for a couple of years in the beginning of the early 17th century, pardon me. If we look at their business network and their business profiling, we have an example of the complexity and the multiple regions involved in the gains that they obtain from slave trading. Because, for example, they insure their vessels in the Netherlands. So what was the Dutch Republic, what is today the Netherlands? Their credit comes from France as well as from the southern Netherlands, so they're credit providers. The ships are freighted in the Dutch Republic, and they are outfitted and they are provisioned there. But they conduct trade, their slave trade is with Spanish America, and using Angola as the main source of supply. So they have to go to Lisbon to get permissions to operate in the trade, to go to visit Luanda. They also have to go to Seville to obtain permission to operate within the frame of the Asiento. So they have to stop in Portugal for a couple of weeks. They have to stop in Sevilla for a couple of weeks, which means that they will need to acquire some provisions as well there. Then they go to Angola. That's where they acquire their slaves. And as we know from the literature, you often are not dispatched within a couple of days. You need to stay there a couple of weeks. So again, they get provisions in Angola itself. Once they arrive in the Spanish West Indies, which is where they deliver the enslaved Africans that they are trading, they again have to stay a couple of weeks to be able to outfit the ship again, acquire the products that they are bringing back to Europe. So again, when we think of the gains from logistics, there's multiple entities across multiple countries that will gain from provisioning for the voyages of these men. The Belmonte family and their partners, they are involved in slave trading in Angola, as I said, but they also are involved in trading of slave-produced goods in Africa, like African hides and gold extracted in Africa. They are involved also on the sugar trade, especially Brazilian sugar trade, and they bring the sugar to Europe, but they are also involved in the redistribution business of the sugar trade to the North American market, to the Northern European markets, but also to the Mediterranean market, where they also sell those, in fact, already processed sugar. So from here we can see that, you know, there's multiple actors in multiple regions across multiple empires gaining from the operations of this specific family, and the family itself is gaining and participating in the slave trade and in commerce of slave-produced goods in different ways. They are doing that. In the long run, if these families, in fact, through this business, but also other businesses that they had in their portfolio, they are also going to acquire a lot of social prestige and political leverage. So we could also say that to a certain extent, their involvement in these activities will also bring them social and political gains from being involved in these two activities, which is something that we cannot account for, we cannot quantify, but it's something that is extremely important. A descendant of this family by the end of the 17th century, Manuel Belmonte, is the ambassador of the King of Spain. He is the man that will negotiate the agreement, the lease the leasing of the Spanish Asiento by the Dutch West India Company, to give an example of how much prestige you can accumulate. Of course, it's not only through the slave trade, but that also enabled them to accumulate wealth. So did commerce in slave-produced goods. So to finish, because I think I have already talked too much, I don't have the timer with me. What I would like to propose is that if we want to move this discussion on profits and, well, I would say gains rather than profits, because I think profits is too reductive, on slave trade and slave-produced and commerce in slave-produced goods, I think we need to move beyond the national approach that so far has dominated the discussions, and we also need to move beyond the imperial spaces and beyond the Atlantic. And I think in my opinion, we need to move also beyond the numbers. Not to say that we should abandon quantification altogether, that's not what I'm saying, but we need to look at other sources that do not provide figures, but they can be very telling about how to reconstruct the political economy of the trade, both the slave trade and the trade in slave-produced commodities, because these can be very informative about who is gaining how much and why. To do this, I think we need a combination of multiple methodologies. On one hand, I think we will need to rely on reconstruction of business networks, which was the two exercises I have done and presented here today. But another methodology, which I think is essential, is the reconstruction of value chains of goods that have been produced by enslaved Africans, because that will lead us to the gainers that in fact are invisible, because there's no direct link between them and the slave trade itself or the trade in slave-produced goods. To do this, I think it is essential to move beyond the European sources. Most of the research so far has been done with European sources alone. I think we need to start looking also at sources in Asia, that especially sources from the European East India companies in Asia, but also sources in the Americas, in Brazil, but also in the US. In the Caribbean, these sources have been a bit more explored, I think not in this perspective, but still. And also sources in Africa. There aren't many, but there are some. And try to combine these source materials from different origins, because together they will give us a much comprehensive picture of what was going on in terms of profits of both slave trade and slave-produced goods. And for this, I think it's essential also to adopt a triangulation of different types of sources. On one hand, business papers, for example, which have been explored but can be further explored because they are very rich, and in combination with state papers, but also with travelogues and descriptive narratives, especially in the case of Africa, for which we have less information, they can be very telling about what kind of activities are taking place there on the port, especially who is involved in these activities and how people are gaining as well as losing, because this is not just a story of success, this is also a story of failure as well. And to conclude, because I have talked already too much, I would just leave two final thoughts. I think that, in fact, the gains from slave trading and as well as from commerce in slave-based production are far greater, in fact, and are far broader, far-reaching than have been so far acknowledged by the scholarship, because there's a lot of people gaining that we don't automatically think that they are gaining from these two activities, and there are parts of the world and countries that we also wouldn't think they are gaining from these activities. And the final thought I would like to put forward is that I think numbers alone do not capture the magnitude as well as the consequences of these two activities for societies in the past as well as for the present. Thank you.